Turning up the heat on opposing quarterbacks is critical in today's NFL, and the Seahawks prioritized upgrading their edge rush this offseason. Did they do enough? I'm going to be checking out the edge rushing group as well as the tight ends on our Monday installment of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12s. This is Corbin Smith, your host for Locked On Seahawks. Glad to have you on board for our Monday episode. And as always, thanks for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We are 2 nights away from training camp officially being here. The Seahawks will report to the VMAC tomorrow, and then they'll have their first practice coming up on Wednesday. So the 2022 season drawing ever so close, less than 48 hours away. Going to wrap up our training camp preview today with edge rushers and tight ends, checking out both of those positional groups, asking the essential questions, looking at some spotlight players and making some bold predictions. Plus, going to be continuing our 90-player countdown with numbers 20 through 16. Jam-packed episode coming your way, and it's brought to you by Bet Online. Bet Online has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. Bet Online, where the game starts. The Seahawks, like the rest of the NFL, they're always looking for as many quarterback hunters as they can find, and it's well documented that Seattle has not necessarily been great harassing quarterbacks the last several seasons, really since Frank Clark left after the 2018 season and traded the Chiefs. Seattle, at best, has been inconsistent going after the quarterback. Last year was especially a troublesome season for them. They finished near the bottom of the league in sacks and quarterback hits, so it's not surprising that Pete Carroll went out, made some changes on his coaching staff. They changed up their scheme from a 4-3 to more of a 3-4 style defense under new coordinator Clint Hurt, and they switched up their personnel by bringing in much more athletic players that fit that 3-4 defense, like Uchenna Nwosu and second-round pick Boye Mafe. The real question is, with those moves on the coaching staff and on the roster, did the Seahawks do enough for this group to really be sparked and get after the quarterback this season? And that's really the biggest question on defense for the Seahawks team, because at the end of the day, if you want to win in today's NFL, you got to be able to turn up the heat on opposing quarterbacks. And Seattle simply did not get that done enough last season. Late in the year, you started to see a bit of improvement with Carlos Dunlap going off. But really, for most of the season, that was a struggle. And so, again, they switched things up. You've got a 3-4 style defense. You need different personnel. Out is Kerry Hyder. Out is Carlos Dunlap. Out is Benson Mayowa. In, you've got Uchenna Nwosu teaming up with Daryl Taylor. You've got Boye Mafe, Alton Robinson. You drafted Tyreek Smith. Aaron Donkor might be a wild card to keep a close eye on in his second season with the team. Much different style pass rushers that the Seahawks are going to be using this year. But the bottom line really is, at the end of the day, is that personnel switch and the scheme switch going to be enough to get this team ignited? And for me, before I get to spotlighted players here, there's several you could look at, but there's been a lot of discussion about Uchenna Nwosu coming in from the Chargers, playing in a 3-4 defense, very similar to the one that he starred in for the Chargers a year ago. Had 40 pressures last season, his first year as a starter in the league. He's only 25. Daryl Taylor had 6.5 sacks last season. He was the only Seahawk last year that was in their first 2 seasons to do that. He's only the 6th player ever in his first season with the team to have at least 6 sacks. So they've got some good, intriguing, young, athletic talent. You mix in Boye Mafe, who probably has the highest ceiling of those 3 players. Maybe the rawest, but the highest ceiling. And there's obviously a lot of talent to work with, but really you look at the stats and you got to wonder necessarily if the Seahawks are going to be that much better from a production standpoint. Using Pro Football Focus data, checking out pressure rates here. First one that we've got our true pass set, and then we've also got our regular pass rushing. And how they're different, Pro Football Focus, their pressure rates, the regular pressure rates, these are all the snaps that NFL rushers have rushing the passer, regardless of whether it's screens, whether it's dump offs on play action, you name it. It's every time that they rush the passer. And when you look at that, the 3 newcomers, Mafe and Smith, obviously their numbers are reflected from college, so that has to be taken with a grain of salt. But those two, as well as Uchenna Nwosu, you look at their pressure percentages. Nwosu, 9.8, that's okay, not great necessarily on over 400 pass rushing attempts. Mafe and Smith were two of the better rushers in the Big Ten Conference, and Mafe got second team all Big Ten for that reason. Very effective with the reps that he had. But Carlos Dunlap and Taylor were easily the most effective players the Seahawks had at consistently turning up the heat on quarterbacks. Alton Robinson coming in at third at 10.4%. I personally think, and I'm not big on all of the individualized stats that Pro Football Focus has come out with, but one that I think certainly paints an interesting picture that is worth noting is that true pressure rate that eliminates screen plays, play action, and plays where the opponent rushes three or fewer rushers. These are plays that make it difficult to truly evaluate pass rushers. And just look how much of a spike all of these guys have. Tyreke Smith, 27.3% of his true pass rushing sets, he got a pressure on the quarterback in college. Mafe, 25%. Alton Robinson actually led the Seahawks in this category. Almost 20% of Robinson's rushes on true pass sets, he was able to generate a pressure. Daryl Taylor, a very impressive 15.2%. Dunlap at 13%. And I think what's really revealing here, Nwosu is at the bottom of the list. Every qualified player that rushed off the edge for the Seahawks had a higher true pressure rate than Nwosu did last season. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Nwosu is a bad free agent signing. In fact, I believe the contrary. I think this kid is on the verge of a breakout. 40 pressures last year should not be taken lightly. He had 5 sacks, which would have been 4th on the Seahawks roster. And it feels like he's just coming into his own. But the point of putting those stats up and looking at Daryl Taylor as my spotlight player, it feels like Taylor, he's kind of gone under the radar in some regards. Everybody's been talking about the Nwosu signing, and that's fine. I think Nwosu is going to be a really good player. But as I've been preaching all offseason, Daryl Taylor, I'm impressed with the fact that he had a pass rushing percentage, or a pressure percentage, over 15% on those true pass sets last year. And we saw him starting to really come into his own. Even if the sack numbers weren't there the second half of the season, he had 4 in his first 5 games, and then he tailed off in that regard. The pressures were still there, and the way he was generating those pressures, he was winning with speed. He was winning with finesse. And ask Braden Smith of the Colts in the season opener, occasionally, he was winning with impressive bull rushes. And if he can find a way to harness that power aspect of his game and use it a bit more effectively on a consistent basis with his athleticism, his quickness, his agility, his improving counter moves, you couple all those things together in this scheme, then I think Daryl Taylor's absolutely got a chance to blow up. And that leads me into my bold prediction for the pass rushers. I've thought about Boye Mafe, Nwosu. I think both of them have a chance to have really good seasons for the Seahawks. I love the scheme for all 3 of these players, but I got to stick with my man Daryl Taylor because, again, this is really his sophomore season. He missed his entire rookie year with a broken leg. Comes in last year's pseudo-rookie season, finishes tied for second on the team with 6.5 sacks, led the team with pressures according to Pro Football Focus. So you see the flashes. You see the ability. I think he's really going to come into his own this year. So my bold prediction, maybe it isn't necessarily bold, but I think Taylor becomes the first edge rusher to eclipse 10 sacks and hit double digits since Frank Clark did it back in 2018. And I think he also finishes in the top 5 in the NFL in strip sacks. I think that's the other thing that he is going to really improve upon this year. We saw it against Kirk Cousins last year in Minnesota. His ability to get his hands on the football while pressuring and trying to sack the quarterback. Daryl Taylor has always been good at that. I think he's going to take a big step forward there and have a chance to create a lot of turnovers for the Seahawks. So really my bold prediction, Daryl Taylor's going to have a monster season for the Seahawks. I think this scheme is a perfect fit for him. I think you're going to see him round into a more consistent, well-rounded player this year for the Seahawks. And if they can have that happen with Nwosu, Mafe, Alton Robinson, they can get healthy. Knee, I think, caused him some problems last year, but still at a high pressure rate. And Tyreke Smith being the wild card there, this could be a group that's pretty good. I don't know if they're where they want to be just yet, but you've got a young foundation where this group in the next couple of years could end up being a terrorizing force for opposing quarterbacks, and that's what the Seahawks are looking for. Up next, I'm going to continue our 90-player countdown with numbers 20 through 16. That's right, we're officially in the top 20. Going to be wrapping this list up in the opening days of training camp before we get to the invaluable padded practices. So again, going to be looking at numbers 20 through 16, a number of key veterans, a couple of newcomers as well. Going to be checking out on our countdown. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. Find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including the second half of this Major League Baseball season. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sporting and wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. You're listening to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, Monday edition. It's training camp week. I'm your host, Corbin Smith, getting fired up with training camp set to start on Wednesday. Seattle's players, all the rookies, the veterans, everybody's going to be reporting the same day tomorrow. So we're less than 48 hours away from the 2022 season being here, and the Seahawks getting ready to kick things off. Couldn't be more excited about that. Thanks for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Getting back to our top 90 player countdown, we are down to numbers 20 through 16. I was getting ahead of myself there with us being in the top 20. It is a lot of players to go through every year when we do this series. And getting to start off our next segment here, coming in at number 20, Will Dissly. And I'm going to have a chance to talk about him a lot on this show. Dissly is a player that has kind of been interesting the last few years. On one hand, he's been healthy, which is huge. His first two seasons, he was off to fast starts. And then his rookie year, suffers a patellar tendon injury in week 4, misses the rest of the season. And then his sophomore year, first 6 games, I thought Will Dissly was playing like an all-pro caliber tight end. He was putting up big numbers in the passing game. He was blocking well. You couldn't even tell he had a severe knee injury. And then he pops his Achilles and misses the rest of the season. And so that almost felt like a much more debilitating injury at that point, just because back-to-back seasons having severe lower body injuries. A lot of people were questioning whether Will Dissly was going to be able to make it back and be the same player. And to an extent, he has been since he's returned. He's only missed 1 game the last 2 years. He's been healthy, but the numbers as a pass catcher have not been there. Less than 500 total yards receiving and just 3 touchdowns. He and Russell Wilson seemed to have such a rapport the first 2 years. In the last 2 seasons, that just wasn't the case. It just seemed like a lot of the time he was a forgotten asset. And some of it is having DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett on the outside, some of the other players that Russell Wilson was throwing to. There's only one football to go around. But Dissly just seemed to disappear a lot of the time as a receiver, which is surprising because even though he's not a great athlete necessarily, not a burner, the guy knows how to get open. He's got soft hands for a former defensive lineman. So really, he's going to be one of the key players to watch with a new quarterback under center. Geno Smith or Drew Lock, are they going to be looking more for Will Dissly because he does have steady hands and he can be a reliable chain mover, not a guy that's going to stretch the field vertically, but you couple that with the fact he's one of the most respected blocking tight ends out there. That's why the Seahawks paid him 3 years, $24 million, because he's a very good all-around tight end. They'd like to see those pass-catching numbers increase this year after 2 somewhat down seasons and also remain a force in the run and pass blocking department. He does that, he's got a chance to have maybe a breakout season by his standards if he's able to stay healthy for a 3rd straight year. Next up on the list at number 19, Will Dissly has been a starter for a number of years. Cody Barton has yet to really have that opportunity. He has started a handful of games in his 3 years in the NFL. He's been stuck in KJ Wright and Bobby Wagner's shadow. And I guess to an extent, you can even say Jordan Brooks. Jordan Brooks coming in as a 1st-round pick. He got to play right away once there were injuries at linebacker and they moved KJ Wright over to the same linebacker spot. Brooks got to play a lot of games and started a number of games his rookie year. Cody Barton got bypassed. So Barton's just been biding his time. He's been one of Seattle's best special teams players, and he brings a different skill set to the table than Bobby Wagner, the player that he's going to be attempting to replace in the middle. The Seahawks, they're not going to ask him to replace an 8-time All-Pro. They're not looking for him to replace all of that production, but Barton is a player that in his limited action has flashed. He has shown that he can make plays against the run. He had a 14-tackle game against the Vikings 2 years ago. He's a former safety, so he's naturally a pretty good cover linebacker. Hasn't had a lot of opportunities, but he had a couple pass breakups, replacing Wagner late last season in wins over the Lions and the Cardinals. And he can blitz a little bit. He's a good athlete, so you can blitz him, send him after the quarterback occasionally. So there's a lot of things to like. He's not Bobby Wagner 2.0, but certainly a player that could be a starter caliber player. hasn't had that opportunity now. And being in the final year of his rookie contract, there's a lot on the line. If he's able to go out and play well next to Jordan Brooks, the Seahawks may prioritize re-signing him, bringing him back. He might even play his way out of Seattle's plans just by price. Another team might look at him as a young linebacker and want it. So there is a lot at stake for Cody Barton, not just this year, but down the line. The Seahawks are going to be counting on him to fill that big void and be able to provide some production both as a run defender and in coverage, which has been a bit of an issue for the Seahawks in the middle of their defense. So some pressure on Barton, but certainly the Seahawks coaching staff believes in him, and they made that clear by not drafting any other linebackers in a pretty darn good draft class at the position in April. And up next in the secondary, shifting to another player who really hadn't gotten a lot of opportunities to start until last year. Sidney Jones, his was more about injuries. This is a guy that was a first-round pick in waiting coming out of Washington, and then he suffered an Achilles injury in his pro day workout. He slips into the second round. The Philadelphia Eagles picked him, and then he couldn't get healthy. In 3 years of the Eagles, had several injuries. In Jacksonville, even got banged up a little bit. The Seahawks trade for him last year. He's still only 26 years old, and Jones was one of the best corners in the NFL the last 6 or 7 weeks last season. He did not allow a single touchdown in coverage during that span. He was fourth among qualified corners in passer rating against, according to Pro Football Focus, and allowed just a 56% completion rate. So he was balling in the second half of the season. After he replaced Trey Brown in the lineup in Week 11, played outstanding football. Early on, he struggled. He gave up 2 long touchdowns in his first game against the 49ers. You could tell he was just not quite with the system yet. He'd only been with the team a few weeks, but at the end of the year, he really found his groove, and the Seahawks rewarded him with a 1-year prove-it deal. He's got a chance to maybe play his way into a long-term starting role. He's going to have to earn that spot, though, this year. The Seahawks aren't just going to give it to him, especially with 2 draft picks used at the cornerback position. So he's going to have to prove what he played like the last 6 or 7 games. Last year wasn't a fluke, particularly when it comes to tackling. That was maybe the biggest deficiency in Jones's game coming into the NFL. There were questions about his physicality, his ability to come up and make plays against screens in the run game. And yet last year, easily the most impressive season he had in that regard. 66 tackles, a career high, blew up a couple screens on third down plays, and also made some nice plays against the run. So really had the best season of his career. The Seahawks are hoping that's just a building block for a really talented player that's had some bad injury fortunes dating since his college career. So they're hoping that that's past him. He's able to stay healthy and can really be an asset in their secondary. Shifting over to the offense, another player that's had injury issues, D. Eskridge, had such high expectations last year. And when you're a second-round pick and you're picked before the number 1 center in the draft class, Creed Humphrey, a player many thought the Seahawks should have taken with that selection. They instead picked Eskridge. There's a lot of pressure on you to perform, especially when a player like Humphrey goes out and then has a dominant rookie season. Everybody's going to be looking back at that pick. Eskridge's problem wasn't necessarily that he wasn't good enough. The issue was he couldn't get on the field and stay healthy, and he was set back by some significant injuries. He missed 7 games with a severe concussion. That is not something to mess around with. There were even some murmurs at one point he might not make it back during the season. That's how bad it was. He had to go see a specialist. They got him back. He had one really good game against the 49ers at home in Week 13, scored his only touchdown in that game. And then after that, he and Russell Wilson just never were able to get on the same page. I think a lot of that had to do, they just didn't have enough reps together. When you add in the fact Eskridge missed most of camp with a foot injury, a toe injury, and then he also was dealing with some other stuff late in the year, his injuries and his durability concerns really impacted the ability of those two to be able to build a connection. So now Eskridge, he's going to be trying to do that with Smith or Locke. He's got all the physical tools, blazing speed, outstanding quickness, can break tackles, can create after the catch. He's an asset in the bubble game on swing passes. He's an asset when you're running him on jet sweeps, but you can't be predictable with him. And that was the other issue last year. Way too many times he'd come in the game and opponents would know, oh, he's going to run a jet sweep. And that's exactly what happened. They blew it up. Got to get the ball to him in different ways, whether it's in the screen game, quick passes like slants, dig routes, or downfield. He's got some vertical playability with his sub 4.4 speed. This is a player that should be an asset for them if he can stay healthy. Shane Waldron's got to find ways to scheme the football to him. And I think that it should be easier to do that with the talent that is around him. Teams aren't going to be able to put a lot of attention on D. Eskridge with Metcalf and Lockett. So the talent's there. Now it's on the coaching staff to get him involved properly, get the football in his hands, and he's got to be able to stay healthy. unlike what he did a year ago. And closing off this last cluster, coming in at number 16, a player that I have thought for many years is one of the most overlooked defensive tackles in the NFL, and that is Shelby Harris. And this guy's had such an interesting path to Seattle. In fact, he was looking at signing with the Seahawks. He tried out for the Seahawks 6 years ago when he was on the free agent market. He got released by a number of teams. He thought about quitting at one point. The Seahawks were one of the teams that looked at him, and they didn't sign him. Eventually landed in Denver, and that's where things changed for Harris. And this is a guy that over 300 pounds is a pretty good interior pass rusher. 3 of the last 5 seasons, at least 5 sacks. Pro Football Focus has also given him at least a 76 grade against the run in 3 of the last 5 seasons. One of those other years, he was nearly at a 70. So he has consistently been a great run defender, and he excels in a 3-4 defense, which is exactly why the Seahawks were excited to have him as part of that package that sent Russell Wilson to Denver. This is a player that has played for Vic Fangio the last 3 years. The coaching staff with Clint Hurt, Sean Desai, they both have been under Vic Fangio. There's going to be Fangio principles in this defense. So who better to bring in than somebody that thrived in Fangio's scheme like Shelby Harris? I think he's one of the starters on that defensive line. Al Woods is going to be your nose. Poona Ford and Shelby Harris probably going to be your other defensive tackles, or if you want to call them defensive ends, the 3-tech, 4-eye technique, going to be playing that position. And they're going to be looking for him to contribute both as a pass rusher and a run defender. He's shown the last 5 years he's capable of excelling at both. And so I think this is one of the underrated additions for Seattle. Yes, it stinks it came with trading your best quarterback in franchise history, but certainly you wanted to maximize your package. And the Seahawks were able to do that, bringing in players like Noah Fant and Shelby Harris, who should be a starter and be an impact player for an already really good interior defensive line. His presence just makes them that much better. Wrapping up our training camp preview, we've looked at all the other position groups, going to save the best for last. The tight ends, a position that there's been high expectations the last several years, and that hasn't necessarily happened on the field just yet. Will that change in 2022? I'm going to be taking a look at a depth chart, some spotlighted players, and a bold prediction of the tight end position here in a moment. If you're living paycheck to paycheck or struggling to make ends meet, it can be really stressful when unexpected expenses come up. Now Dave can help you get out of a pinch when you really need it. Dave is the banking app that can help you get up to $500 instantly with extra cash. That's more money to fill your tank, buy a wedding gift, or catch up on bills. You can finally tackle those expenses that have been stressing you out without any hangups. There's no interest and no credit check needed. Millions of people have already downloaded the Dave app to get the financial relief they need with extra cash. Download the Dave app from the App Store right now. That's DAVE. Sign up for an extra cash account and get up to $500 instantly. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Instant transfer fees apply. Banking provided by Evolve, member FDIC. You're listening to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Thanks as always for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week, whether it's streaming live on YouTube or on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen. We greatly appreciate it. And make sure to make the Locked On NFL podcast your second listen. Our national NFL experts and insiders keep fans dialed in with the biggest stories and latest news from around the league year-round, because an offseason doesn't equal a break in the action. Over the last several seasons, there have been really high expectations for the Seahawks at tight end. A few years ago, they brought in an aging Greg Olsen, but many believed that he still had something left in the tank, thought that he was going to be a difference maker for them. Jacob Hollister at one point was a player that fans are really excited about. Will Dissly staying healthy. Maybe he can put up some big numbers. Gerald Everett coming in last year, reuniting with Shane Waldron, his former tight end coach with the Rams. So many different names that have rotated in and out of Seattle the last 3 or 4 years, ever since Jimmy Graham left after the 2017 season. And yet those expectations, unfortunately, have not been met for the most part, at least in the passing game. And that leads to the essential question for the tight ends this year. Is this the year that the hype actually translates to production on the field for the Seahawks at the tight end position? And you look at the players that they have on the depth chart currently. There's a lot of talent in this group. Noah Fant, one of the focal points of that Russell Wilson trade, along with Shelby Harris and bringing in Drew Lock to compete to replace Russell Wilson. Fant is a former first-round pick for a reason. He's got outstanding speed, really soft hands. He can stretch the field, can create after the catch. You couple him with Will Dissly, who's polar opposite player skill set wise, a big physical blocker, not going to blow by people with speed, but he's a solid route runner. He's got good soft hands as well, a red zone threat. And then the X factor in all this, Colby Parkinson, a player that's got 6'7" size with receiver speed and the ability to be a matchup nightmare in short yardage and red zone situations. And they got a couple other intriguing youngsters in Tyler Mabry and Cade Brewer, who had a really good offseason program. This group certainly has the pieces in place to be a problem for opponents this year. But the last however many seasons, it feels like really most of Pete Carroll's tenure, the Seahawks have not been able to get tight ends involved in the passing game as they should have been able to. They've had a lot of talent there. When Zach Miller was around, Miller came up with some clutch catches, but his overall production was not great. He was more of an asset as a run blocker, but when they signed him, he was a very productive receiver with the then Oakland Raiders. And then Jimmy Graham, he put up some big numbers, and still a lot of people thought the Seahawks didn't necessarily maximize his talents as one of the best receiving tight ends that the game has ever seen. Greg Olsen still was a solid player at the end of his career, and yet there weren't targets there for him. Jacob Hollister had one decent year and then slipped off. And then last year, Gerald Everett had a very up and down season. He had a little over 400 receiving yards, which is the most they've had at tight end since 2017. But he also dropped some passes and had some issues, particularly in the end zone, with coughing up perfect throws from Russell Wilson. One of them led to an interception against the 49ers. So they decided to move on there. After they'd acquired Noah Fant in the Wilson trade, decided no more Gerald Everett. Let's get to the spotlighted player here. Who is the guy that's really going to be the difference maker if tight end is going to live up to expectations? I think that Noah Fant is going to be a very nice addition to this offense with the speed, the pass catching ability, his formational versatility. He can play H-back, he can play inline, he can play the slot. That's going to be a great asset for Shane Waldron's offense, which I expect is going to run a lot of 12 personnel. But I really think the wild card here is Colby Parkinson. And we have seen it. Those of us that have been at training camp have seen what this kid can do. In my opinion, he was the best player on offense the first 2 weeks of training camp last year. He showed up about 10 pounds heavier with a chiseled body at 6'7". He was making at least one or two long catches every single practice, and you could just see the long strides and how much of a problem that he was for Seattle secondary. They couldn't match up with him physically, and they had a hard time with how quick he was for his size. And then he re-injured his foot. He's had a broken foot each of the last 2 summers, and he's had to start the year on the injured list. And so that has set back his development tremendously. But this kid just has size and catching skills that very few tight ends in the league have. And I think he can be kind of like what Tyler Higbee was for Shane Waldron as the passing game coordinator with the Rams. I really believe that he can be a player that even playing only 35-40% of the snaps can be a real difference maker, particularly when you're in the red zone. You just don't see very many weapons that have the size and the athleticism that Parkinson brings to the table. And I think if you're an inventive, creative coordinator like the Seahawks believe that Shane Waldron is, Will Dissly's a fun player, and you're certainly going to play him a lot of snaps, but you got to love the possibility of running 12 personnel and having DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett or Eskridge on the outside and having Fant and Parkinson as your 2 tight ends. The flexibility that you can have when you have 2 tight ends that can run routes and create separation like these 2 guys can, and they have really reliable hands. As a coordinator, you should be salivating about the prospects of being able to put those 2 guys in the field together to give your quarterback options, especially when you don't have Russell Wilson anymore. You can really have a nice security blanket with both these players. So I said this last year, I'll say it again. I think Parkinson is the X factor here. And I don't know that he is going to get a ton of snaps necessarily because Will Dissly's going to play a lot, Fant's going to play a lot, but I would expect that all 3 of these guys are going to get extensive snaps as long as Parkinson this time can stay healthy, and they maybe just now can see him fulfill his promise that we haven't gotten to see the first 2 seasons in large part due to injury. He's been limited to 7 catches. Hopefully he's past those injuries and he can really put everything together this year and become the weapon that the Seahawks believe he can be in the passing game, which leads me to my bold prediction here. I thought about Noah Fant here, and I think that Fant's got a really good chance to surpass his career high in receiving yardage, especially if Drew Lock ends up winning the job with his relationship he already has with Lock from their time together in Denver. And Lock, that was his favorite receiver. He had the most success throwing the football to Noah Fant of all the receivers and tight ends that he had his 3 years in Denver. But I don't know that he can get to 750 or 800 yards receiving just because of Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. It's going to be very difficult for him to do that, especially in the offense with the quarterbacks they have. So I'm going to go with this curveball. I think Noah Fant is going to lead Seattle in receptions and receiving yards to the tight end position. But I think Colby Parkinson is going to lead the team with 5 receiving touchdowns. Maybe Noah Fant ends up getting more than that. I've kicked around the idea, but I just think it's going to be really tough to get the football to a number of these different guys. There's only one football out there. There's only so many touchdowns to go around. And who knows what this offense is going to look like. Pretty low expectations going into the season. But Parkinson, with his size and the matchup problem he creates for linebackers, corners, and safeties alike, you have to believe that Geno Smith or Drew Lock is going to try to get the football to him. And I think that Shane Waldron, as long as he's healthy, he is going to try to get packages in there for Colby Parkinson when they're in the red zone to utilize that size, speed, and those reliable hands. So I think Parkinson leads the team in touchdown receptions at the tight end position. Noah Fant's going to lead receiving and receiving yards. I don't know necessarily that the numbers individually are going to be much better than they have been in the past, but I do think as a group collectively that this is the year that tight ends become a bigger part of the offense. And I think a lot of it's going to have to do with necessity, with who's under center. Provide those security blankets for your quarterback. If that happens with the receiving talent that Seattle has, they've got a really good chance for this offense to at least be decent and be able to put some points to the board, move the chains, keep the defense off the field, and maybe play a little bit of ball control football. Having good tight ends in the passing game is a big part of that, along with the run game. So I'm expecting Waldron is going to dial up as many plays as he can to get these tight ends involved. And I think the two quarterbacks, whoever's the starter, I think both these guys are going to be more willing to throw to tight ends than what Russell Wilson has been in the past. That was one of the big Achilles heels in Wilson's game, whether it was his fault or the coordinator's fault. We're going to kind of find that out now with two new quarterbacks under center. But certainly there's a lot of optimism. There has been the last few years. This time, though, it does feel different. We'll see how things look on the field once the Seahawks kick off training camp on Wednesday and then they get into the preseason games, where these tight ends fit. But this is a talented group that should put up some pretty darn good numbers for the Seahawks this upcoming season. As always, you can follow me on Twitter at Corbin Smith NFL. You can check out Locked On Seahawks on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and streaming 5 days a week on YouTube. Coming up on our Tuesday show, we're going to be looking at some top storylines heading into training camp on offense and defense with the coaching staff, you name it. Our final training camp primer, Rob Morang, will be rejoining me, and we'll be live at 5 p.m. on YouTube. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for listening in. Go Hawks.